A Norwegian ship's log from 1752 records the crew abandoning their vessel after something rose from beneath them and began pulling the hull apart. They made it to shore. The ship didn't. No storm was reported that day. No rocks. Just deep water and whatever lived in it. This wasn't fiction. This was an official maritime record filed with the Danish-Norwegian Navy, and it wasn't alone. Across 3 centuries of sailing logs, pirate journals, and naval reports, the same creature surfaces again and again. Not as myth, as testimony. The Kraken wasn't a story sailors told to scare each other. It was the thing they wrote about when they got back to port and tried to explain why half their crew was gone. The earliest confirmed mention appears in Swedish sailors' accounts from the 1180s. Not a legend passed down through generations. A first-hand description written by men who claimed they watched islands rise from the sea, then sink again, taking ships with them. By the time the golden age of piracy arrived in the 1600s, the Kraken had become the single most documented sea monster in maritime history. Captains who logged their positions, their cargo, and their casualties also logged encounters with something that defied every other category. Here's what makes the Kraken different from every other sea creature in nautical mythology. Mermaids were symbols. Sea serpents were explanations for distant shapes on the horizon. The Kraken was tactical information. Pirates and naval officers alike warned each other about specific coordinates, certain depths, times of year when the thing was active. They drew maps around it. The description stayed consistent across centuries and oceans. Massive tentacles surfacing without warning, suction cups the size of dinner plates. A body that never fully breached, but displaced enough water to create whirlpools that could pull a frigate under. Witnesses described the smell, a mixture of rotting fish and something acidic that burned the throat. They described the sound, a deep vibration felt in the chest before anything broke the surface. These weren't the embellishments of drunken storytelling. These were repeating patterns in official records written by men whose careers depended on accuracy. In 1734, a missionary named Hans Egede was traveling the waters off Greenland when his ship encountered what he later described as a creature whose body rose higher than the mainmast. Tentacles thick as the ship's beams wrapped the hull. The crew fired muskets directly into the mass. It released them and sank, leaving behind a slick on the water that took hours to dissipate. Egede was a man of the church, not given to exaggeration, and his account was corroborated by every member of his crew in sworn statements. Pirates had their own relationship with the Kraken. Unlike naval vessels bound to established routes, pirate ships operated in uncharted waters. They went where the maps ended. And they came back with stories that naval officers dismissed until they sailed the same routes and filed the same reports. Blackbeard's logs, the fragments that survive, contain a passage describing his crew refusing to pursue a Spanish galleon into a specific stretch of Caribbean water, not because of Spanish guns, because of something his quartermaster had seen there on a previous voyage. Blackbeard, a man who blockaded Charleston and fought the Royal Navy in open combat, turned his ship around. What were they actually seeing? The rational explanations started forming in the 18th century and haven't stopped. Giant squid became the default answer. Architeuthis ducks, confirmed to exist in 1857 when a specimen washed ashore in Denmark. They grow up to 43 feet long. They have tentacles. They inhabit deep water. The match seemed obvious, except the sizes don't work. The largest confirmed giant squid ever recorded was 43 feet from tip to tentacle. The Kraken descriptions consistently put the creature at double or triple that size. Witnesses described tentacles that could wrap a ship's hull completely, which would require a reach exceeding 100 feet. No squid species, living or extinct, matches that scale. Not even the colossal squid, larger and more aggressive than its giant cousin, reaches the dimensions recorded in these logs. Then there's the behavior. Giant squid are deep water hunters. They avoid surface activity. They certainly don't attack ships. Every confirmed interaction between humans and giant squid has involved dying or disoriented specimens, not aggressive surface predators. The Kraken accounts describe deliberate attacks on vessels, tentacles wrapping hulls with enough force to crack timber, prolonged engagements lasting minutes, not the brief thrashing of a confused animal. Some researchers pointed to whales. Sperm whales battle giant squid in deep water, and the suction cup scars on their skin prove the fights are real. Could surfacing whales have been misidentified? It's possible for a single sighting. It doesn't explain why experienced whalers, men who hunted sperm whales for a living, also reported Kraken encounters and drew clear distinctions between the two. The most unsettling pattern in the historical record isn't what was described. It's where it was described. Plot every documented Kraken sighting on a map and a pattern emerges. Deep ocean trenches, the edges of continental shelves. Anywhere the seafloor drops suddenly from shallow to abyssal depths. These are the exact environments where modern marine biology admits we've explored less than 5% of what exists. In 1873, a fisherman off Newfoundland hooked something that pulled his dory backward through the water. When he cut the line and looked over the side, he saw a tentacle as thick as his leg rising toward the boat. He brought an axe down on it. The severed piece, preserved in alcohol, measured 19 feet long and remains in a museum in St. John's to this day. It belongs to no known species. That specimen sits in a jar as physical evidence that something existed in those waters that science still hasn't categorized. And it's not the only one. Unidentified tentacle fragments surface every few decades. Suction cup scars appear on whales that are too large and too numerous to match any cataloged squid species. Sonar readings from deep ocean surveys occasionally pick up masses moving at depths and speeds that don't correspond to known marine life, which brings us to the real question. Not whether the Kraken was real in the sense that pirates believed in it. We know they did. The documentation is overwhelming. The question is whether they were describing something that still exists in waters we've barely touched. Something large enough and rare enough that centuries of shipping traffic only encountered it at the edges of its territory. In the places where the ocean floor disappears into darkness and the food chain operates on rules we're still discovering. Because here's what changed in the last 50 years. Deep-sea exploration technology advanced to the point where we could finally look at the environments those old logs described. The trenches, The abyssal plains, the continental margins where sailing ships feared to go. And we found things. In 2004, researchers filming in the deep Pacific captured footage of a giant squid attacking bait at a depth of 3,000 feet. That was the first time anyone had filmed one alive in its natural habitat. Not dying, not beached, hunting. The specimen was large, approximately 25 feet, but still within the known range for giant squid. It confirmed they existed. It didn't explain the historical accounts describing animals 3 times that size. 2 years later, another expedition filmed a colossal squid, larger, more aggressive, equipped with rotating hooks inside its suckers. The kind of anatomy that could leave the scars documented on sperm whales. The footage revealed behavior nobody had predicted. The squid wasn't passive, it was territorial. When the submersible's light swept across it, the animal didn't flee, it approached. Then in 2012, Japanese researchers captured the first extended footage of a giant squid in deep water. They watched it hunt. They documented feeding behavior, movement patterns, and aggression levels that contradicted everything the scientific establishment had assumed. These animals weren't fragile deep-sea drifters. They were apex predators operating in an environment humans couldn't survive without technology that didn't exist until this century. Every one of those discoveries happened in the last 20 years. Before that, the giant squid was considered semi-mythical despite washing ashore occasionally. Science didn't believe eyewitness accounts. Sailors were dismissed as superstitious. The physical evidence was written off as anomalies. Then cameras went deep enough to prove the sailors right, which raises an obvious problem. If it took until 2004 to film a giant squid and we're still discovering new behaviors in species we've technically known about since the 1850s, what else is down there that we haven't photographed yet? The ocean covers 70% of the planet. We've mapped about 20% of the seafloor in any detail. The remaining 80% is blank space. Topographical surveys exist. Sonar can give you depth, but actual visual exploration. We've seen less than 5% of what's below 12,000 feet. The Mariana Trench alone, the deepest point in any ocean, has been visited by humans exactly 3 times. 3. More people have walked on the moon. Every deep dive expedition discovers species nobody knew existed. In 2021, researchers found a previously unknown predator off the coast of Australia. It measured 16 feet long and lived at depths where sunlight doesn't penetrate. They named it, they cataloged it, they acknowledged that statistically dozens of similar scale discoveries are waiting in adjacent territories we haven't surveyed. Because that's not speculation, that's math based on discovery rates from existing expeditions. The abyss isn't empty. It's packed with life operating under pressure and darkness conditions that require adaptations we're only beginning to understand. Bioluminescence, gigantism, extreme slow metabolism. There are fish down there with teeth too large for their mouths. Squid with eyes the size of dinner plates. Ecosystems built around thermal vents that weren't even discovered until 1977. The deep ocean isn't an alien planet. It's harder to reach than one. So when sailors in the 1700s described tentacles thick as ship masts, when whalers documented attacks by animals larger than anything in the catalogs, when fishermen brought up fragments that didn't match known species. What exactly were they seeing? We know giant squid exist and can reach 40 feet. Colossal squid can exceed that. Both species live at depths where human observation was impossible until this generation. Both species exhibit aggressive territorial behavior when encountered. Both species have anatomy capable of damaging wooden vessels if they surface in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the largest confirmed specimen ever recorded was 43 feet. The historical accounts describe animals twice that size. Either every pre-20th century sailor was systematically exaggerating by the same factor, or something larger than what we've cataloged was operating in those waters. The third option is that it still is, because here's what we actually know. Deep-sea gigantism is real. The deeper you go, the larger certain species grow. Pressure, temperature, food scarcity, all of it selects for size in ways that don't apply to surface environments. The giant squid we've filmed are juveniles and young adults. We've never documented a fully mature specimen in its natural habitat. We don't know how large they get at maximum age because we've never tracked one long enough to find out. The colossal squid specimens we've examined were all sub-adults. Marine biologists openly state that mature adults of that species could exceed any recorded size by substantial margins. We just haven't found one yet, which means the Kraken that pirates described might not have been mythology. It might have been taxonomy we didn't possess. An encounter with something that lives too deep and moves too rarely to show up in fishing nets or beach strandings. Something that surfaces occasionally in deep water shipping lanes, gets spotted by a crew with no camera and no way to prove what they saw, then disappears back into an environment we can't follow it into. The difference between a sea monster and an undocumented species is just a matter of evidence. And evidence requires technology, funding, and luck. For most of human history, we had none of those things. We had eyewitness accounts. We had fragments. We had damage to ships that couldn't be explained by weather or combat. And we had stories that persisted across centuries because the people telling them had no reason to lie and every reason to be believed. The Kraken wasn't invented by pirates. It was reported by them. Reported, documented, and feared to the point where entire shipping routes were altered to avoid the areas where sightings clustered. You don't do that for a legend. You do it for a threat, and if that threat was real in 1750, there's no biological reason it couldn't still be real now. Hunting in waters we've barely looked at with equipment that only just became capable of seeing what's there. The deepest point in the ocean is the Mariana Trench. 7 miles straight down into water so pressurized that it would crush a human body into a compressed mass smaller than a fist. We didn't reach the bottom until 1960. We didn't return until 2012. In the 52 years between those dives, we went to the moon 6 times. Space was easier to access than the bottom of our own ocean. And between those 2 expeditions, we learned something that changed the entire conversation about what might be living down there. The deep ocean isn't empty. It's not a lifeless void. It's packed with organisms that have evolved in complete isolation from surface ecosystems. developing biology so alien that they look like they belong on another planet. Bioluminescent predators that generate their own light to hunt in absolute darkness. Tube worms that survive on chemical energy from volcanic vents instead of sunlight. Fish with transparent skulls and eyes that rotate inside their heads to track prey above them. This isn't speculation. This is documented reality from the last 20 years of deep-sea exploration. Every submersible dive finds species that were completely unknown until the camera passed by them. The census of marine life conducted between 2000 and 2010 cataloged more than 6,000 previously unknown species. That's not 6,000 total discoveries across all of human history. That's 6,000 new species in 1 decade of focused research, and we've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. 5%. Which means 95% of the ocean's benthic environment is unmapped, unfilmed, and completely unknown to science. When pirates said they saw something massive surface near their ship, when whalers described tentacles longer than their vessel, when Navy crews in the 20th century reported sonar contacts that behaved unlike anything in the identification manuals, they were describing encounters in an environment where the vast majority of species remain undiscovered. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's evidence that we haven't looked hard enough. The giant squid wasn't confirmed to exist until 2004 when researchers finally captured footage of a live specimen. Before that, every sighting was dismissed as sailor mythology despite the fact that dead specimens kept washing ashore with regularity. Science didn't believe in the giant squid for centuries while fishermen were literally pulling them up in nets. The colossal squid wasn't confirmed until 2007. The megamouth shark, a 15-foot filter feeder that should be impossible to miss, wasn't discovered until 1976. The frilled shark, a living fossil that looks like something from the Jurassic period, wasn't filmed alive until 2007. These aren't small animals hiding in tide pools. These are massive apex predators living in an environment we assumed we understood. We were wrong every single time. So when historical records describe sea creatures larger than anything currently recognized, the question isn't whether sailors were lying. The question is whether we've actually found the upper limit of what the deep ocean produces. And the answer based on every decade of marine research is no. We haven't. Body size in deep-sea organisms is limited by food availability, predation pressure, and metabolic efficiency. In the deep ocean, predation pressure is minimal because everything down there is adapted to the same extreme conditions. Food availability is low but consistent because of marine snow, the constant rain of organic material from upper ocean layers. And metabolic efficiency in cold water environments favors larger bodies because they retain heat better and require less frequent feeding. Every single environmental factor selects for gigantism, which is why we keep finding larger versions of species we thought we'd already cataloged at maximum size. The problem is observation. A creature that lives at 3,000 feet and only surfaces occasionally in remote shipping lanes isn't going to show up in research surveys. It's not going to beach itself conveniently near a marine biology lab. It's not going to swim past a submersible during the 16 hours per year that we actually spend filming at those depths. It's going to remain undetected until either we get extraordinarily lucky or it does something dramatic enough to force documentation, like attacking a ship. Which brings us back to the historical record, because the encounters that got written down weren't the ones where sailors saw something strange at a distance and shrugged. They were the ones where something massive surfaced directly next to the vessel, close enough to damage rigging, close enough to wrap around masts, close enough that the crew had no choice but to respond. Those reports cluster in specific ocean regions. The North Atlantic between Newfoundland and Iceland, the Norwegian Sea above the Arctic Circle, the deep water channels west of South America. These aren't random locations. They're all areas with extreme depth close to shipping routes, underwater topography that creates upwelling currents, and historical whale populations that would provide adequate food for large predators. They're exactly where you'd expect to find deep-water species that occasionally surface. The Kraken legend didn't spread because one sailor told a good story. It spread because multiple crews across centuries reported similar encounters in overlapping locations. That's not mythology, that's pattern recognition. And patterns in observational data, even anecdotal observational data, are what drive scientific investigation when you don't have the technology to verify directly. We have the technology now. We have submersibles, remote-operated vehicles, sonar systems that can map the ocean floor in detail that would have seemed impossible 50 years ago. What we don't have is the funding or the institutional will to deploy those resources toward finding something that science already dismissed as legend. But every year, fishing vessels pull up fragments. Every year, deep water cameras catch shapes moving at the edge of the frame. Every year, sonar operators mark contacts that don't match known biology. The Kraken isn't hiding, we're just not looking in the right places with the right equipment. And until we do, the question remains open. Not whether sea monsters exist, but whether we're ready to admit that the ocean still holds species large enough, strange enough, and rare enough that they might as well be. The sailors who wrote those logs weren't fools. They were professionals documenting observations in an environment that would kill them if they got careless. When they described something massive rising from below, they were reporting what they saw with the same precision they used to log their position, their cargo, and their heading. We dismissed them because we didn't have the tools to confirm their accounts. Now, we have the tools. We're finding creatures in the deep ocean that weren't supposed to exist. We're discovering behaviors in known species that contradict decades of assumptions. We're mapping terrain that proves most of the ocean floor remains completely unexplored. The Kraken might not be mythology waiting to be debunked. It might be biology waiting to be discovered. Something that lives deep enough to avoid detection, surfaces rarely enough to seem impossible, and grows large enough to justify every warning those old captains wrote in their logs. The ocean is still keeping secrets. Some of them have tentacles,